The air in The Rusty Nail was thick enough to chew. It was a heavy blanket of stale beer, spilled whiskey, and the faint, sharp scent of cheap cologne that the young men by the door seemed to bathe in. It was the final night of the city's annual Battle of the Unsigned, and the bar felt like a place where dreams came to die quietly in a corner. A few dozen people were scattered around, but they weren't really an audience. They were just patrons, their backs to the small raised stage in the corner, lost in their own worlds. Their conversations created a constant, dull roar that bounced off the dark wood paneling and sticky floors, tucked away in the shadows by the emergency exit was a young woman. She was so still she seemed to be part of the wall. She wore a faded denim jacket, worn soft at the elbows, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, messy ponytail. In her hands, she clutched a black electric guitar case like it was a shield. The case was covered in scuffs and scratches, a roadmap of late-night practices and anxious bus rides. A single, peeling sticker of a crescent moon was the only decoration. This was her entire world, held together by a few cheap latches. To the people in the bar, she was just part of the furniture, a ghost waiting for something. On stage, the band before her was finishing their set. They called themselves The Wasted, and they lived up to the name. Their music was a wall of loud, aggressive noise, and their energy was frantic and confident. The lead singer, a lanky guy with a greasy mop of hair, thrashed around the stage, spitting sweat and screaming lyrics into the microphone. A few people near the front nodded along, but most of the room remained completely indifferent. The band didn't seem to care. They were in their own bubble, convinced of their own greatness. As they crashed through their final chord, the feedback screeched like a wounded animal. The singer threw his guitar down with a dramatic flourish, a smattering of applause, more polite than enthusiastic, rippled through the room. The Wasted members started tearing down their gear, making a racket as they banged amps and coiled cables. Their energy was still high, a loud, swaggering cloud of self-importance. As the lead singer stomped past the young woman by the exit, he glanced at her and her single guitar case. A slow, lazy smirk spread across his face. He leaned toward his drummer, just loud enough for her to catch the words. "Good luck, little mouse," he sneered. "Try not to put them all to sleep." His friend chuckled, and they kept walking, not even looking back. The words hit her like a small, sharp pebble. Little mouse, that's what she felt like. Small, quiet, and easy to overlook. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs all night, seemed to sink into her stomach. She looked down at her worn-out sneakers, feeling a hot blush of shame creep up her neck. He was right. Who was she to think she could get up there? They were a band, a force. She was just her. A girl with a guitar and a head full of songs she was too scared to play for anyone. A heavy sigh broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see a large, burly man standing in front of her. He had a thick beard and a tired look in his eyes, like he'd seen this all 1,000 times before. This was Gus, the sound engineer. He was holding a clipboard and looking at her with utter impatience. "You're the last one, right?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of any excitement. "Midnight?" He said the name like it was a question, like he couldn't believe anyone would actually choose it. She just nodded, unable to find her voice. Her throat felt tight and dry. "All right," Gus said, scratching his beard. "Let's get this over with. I just need to mic your amp, and then you're up. Got a pedal or anything?" She shook her head, then remembered the loop pedal and quickly nodded again. She pointed to her guitar case. "Fine, just be quick about it. One want to get out of here sometime before sunrise," he grumbled. Turning and walking back toward the small sound booth at the side of the stage, she was an inconvenience. The final chore of a long night. The last item on a checklist. She watched as the members of the Wasted carried their gear out the back door, laughing and shoving each other. They were already forgetting about her, forgetting about the bar, moving on to the next part of their night. She was nothing to them. She was nothing to the bartender, who was now methodically wiping down the same spot on the bar for the 3rd time. She was nothing to the couple in the corner, who were locked in a deep, quiet argument. She was nothing to the old man sitting alone, staring into his empty glass as if it held all the answers. The stage was now empty. It looked bigger and more intimidating than ever. A single microphone stood on a stand under a harsh spotlight that made the dust motes dance in the air. The rest of the bar was dim, but the stage was painfully bright. It was a place meant to be seen, and the thought of stepping into that light made her feel sick. Her hands were sweating inside the sleeves of her jacket. She remembered why she had signed up for this stupid competition in the first place. It was a dare to herself. After years of playing in her small apartment, writing songs that no one would ever hear, she had promised herself she would do this one thing. She would get on a stage. Just once, to see if she could. To prove to the little mouse inside her that she could be something more. But now, standing here, it felt like the biggest mistake of her life. The sneer of that singer, the tired eyes of the sound guy, the vast indifference of the room. It was all confirmation that she didn't belong here. She could just leave. She could pick up her guitar case, walk out the emergency exit, and be gone in 10 seconds. No one would even notice until Gus came looking for her. He'd be annoyed, but he'd just go home. The world would keep turning. The thought was a huge relief, a warm blanket of escape. But then another thought, quieter but stronger, pushed back. If she left now, the little mouse would win. The fear would win. And she would spend the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she had just been brave for 3 minutes. Gus gave her a look from the sound booth, pointing at his watch and then at the stage. It was time. The young woman took a deep, shaky breath. The air still smelled of beer and cologne, but she tried to find a different scent underneath it, the smell of possibility. She tightened her grip on the handle of her guitar case. It wasn't just a shield. It was a weapon. And inside it was a voice that had been silent for too long. She unclipped the latches, the quiet click-clack sounding strangely loud in her own ears. She pulled out the guitar, its dark, polished wood gleaming under the bar's dim lights. She left the empty case by the wall, like a snake shedding its old skin. Then, with legs that felt like they were made of lead, she took her first step out of the shadows and toward the stage. The 3 steps from the shadows of the exit to the edge of the stage felt like the longest walk of her life. Each footstep landed on the sticky floor with a soft, sickening thud that seemed to echo in the back of her mind. The harsh spotlight hit her face, a sudden blinding glare that made her flinch. For a second she was a deer caught in headlights, completely frozen. The dull roar of the bar was still there, a constant reminder that no one was waiting for her, no one was expecting anything. They were just waiting for the night to be over so they could go home. She forced her legs to move, carrying her up the 2 short steps onto the stage. The wooden planks creaked under her weight, a loud, lonely sound in the vast indifference of the room. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. In and out. She could feel the eyes of the sound engineer, Gus, on her, a boring hole into her back. He was waiting, impatient, ready to get this final, pointless act over with. She didn't look at the few people scattered at the tables. Looking at them would make it real. It would make the fear real. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. 1 foot in front of the other. 1 simple task at a time. She knelt down, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed the small, worn loop pedal on the stage floor. It was her secret weapon, her silent bandmate. She had spent countless hours in her small apartment, teaching herself how to build a world with just this 1 small box and her guitar. She plugged the guitar into the pedal, and the pedal into the amp that Gus had already set up for her. A thin, black cable connected her to the small speaker, a lifeline. She stood up, slung the guitar over her shoulder, and took a moment to tune it. The soft ping-ping of the strings was a familiar comfort, a small ritual that centered her. Pushing back the walls of the room and the weight of the expectations she had placed on herself, the conversations in the bar continued. A glass clinked. Someone laughed loudly. The world was still spinning, completely unaware of the quiet battle being fought on this small wooden stage. She could feel the old fear creeping back, the voice that told her to just play a few chords and get it over with. The voice that said, "See? I told you. Nobody cares." But then she remembered the other voice, the one that had pushed her out of the apartment tonight, the one that said, "Let them." She took one last deep breath, closed her eyes for just a second, and then she began. She didn't strike a loud, attention-grabbing chord. She didn't say a single word into the microphone. Instead, she gently plucked a single, high note on the thinnest string. It was a clear, pure sound that hung in the smoky air like a tiny silver bell. It was so unexpected, so different from the wall of noise that had come before, that it created a small pocket of silence. A man at the bar, who had been telling a loud, boring story, paused mid-sentence. His friend looked at him, annoyed by the sudden quiet. With her foot, she tapped the small button on her loop pedal. A tiny red light began to blink. Then it stayed solid, and the note played again. It was an exact copy of the note she had just played, a perfect echo. She had recorded the first brick of her wall, then she did something even stranger. She started tapping on the body of her guitar. It wasn't a violent beat. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a distant, muffled heartbeat. It was a raw, organic sound, completely out of place in a bar with a proper drum kit just sitting empty. The rhythm was hypnotic, a slow, steady pulse that seemed to match the nervous beating of her own heart. More people were looking now. The couple in the corner, who had been locked in their own tense world, turned their heads toward the stage, their argument forgotten. The bartender, who had been polishing a glass with mechanical precision, stopped and rested his hands on the bar, his eyes narrowed with curiosity. She tapped the pedal again. The heartbeat joined the single, hanging note. The two sounds looped together, creating a simple, atmospheric pattern. The stage was no longer silent. It was alive with a sound that was both simple and strange, a sound that demanded to be investigated. And then she began to pluck a bass line with her thumb. It was a dark, melodic line that wove its way through the hanging note and the steady heartbeat. It wasn't complicated, but it was full of a quiet sadness and a strange kind of hope. It was the sound of walking alone down a rainy street at night, but with the feeling that you might be going somewhere important. She let the bass line play for a few measures, feeling it, becoming one with it. Then she tapped the pedal one more time. Suddenly the stage was full. The single note, the heartbeat, and the dark bass line were all playing together, a rich, layered tapestry of sound that she had created from nothing in less than a minute. The room was now almost completely quiet. The dull roar of conversation had faded to a low murmur, then to nothing at all. People who had been slouched over their phones were now sitting up straight. The old man at the end of the bar, who hadn't looked up from his empty glass all night, slowly turned his head, his tired eyes finding the stage. Even Gus, the tired sound engineer, had leaned forward in his booth, his bored expression replaced by one of genuine intrigue. He was watching the soundboard, but also watching her, trying to figure out what was happening. The young woman on stage was no longer the scared mouse who had walked out of the shadows. She was completely lost in the music, her eyes closed, her body swaying gently to the rhythm she had built. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, powerful focus. This was her world. This was the language she spoke fluently. The guitar was an extension of her body, and the loop pedal was her partner. The crowd, the bar, the fear, it all melted away. There was only the sound, the pulse, the melody. She had built a fortress of sound around herself, and now she was ready to invite them all inside. She opened her eyes, looked out at the silent, watching faces for the first time, and leaned toward the microphone. The foundation was laid. The spell was cast. Now it was time to tell the story. And then she began to sing. The sound that came out of her was not the sound of the quiet, hesitant woman who had walked onto the stage. It was a voice that seemed to come from a different place entirely, a deep and powerful wellspring of emotion that had been held back for a lifetime. It was a voice that was both raw and beautiful, filled with a kind of aching vulnerability that cut through the smoky air like a beam of pure light. It didn't just enter their ears. It wrapped around their hearts and squeezed. The first line of the song was simple, almost a whisper, but it landed in the silent room with the weight of a confession. By the time she reached the first chorus, the transformation of the room was complete. The bar, just minutes ago a place of noisy indifference, was now a sanctuary. The spell she had woven with her loop pedal was now sealed with her voice, and no one wanted to break it. The bartender, a man who had seen 1,000 bands come and go, had completely forgotten about the half-polished glass in his hand. He was leaning against the bar, his arms crossed, a look of pure, unadulterated awe on his face. He had heard it all, from screeching punk rock to mopey folk singers, but he had never heard anything like this. This wasn't just music. It was a story being told from the soul. He found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter the moment dot in the corner. The couple who had been locked in their own tense world were now sitting side by side, their shoulders almost touching. Their forgotten arguments seemed petty and small now, a lifetime away. The woman had a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, and the man had his hand resting gently on her back. They weren't looking at each other. They were both looking at the stage, but in the shared experience of the song, they had found each other again. The music was speaking to the quiet spaces between them, reminding them of something they had lost. Even the old man at the end of the bar, the one who seemed to be permanently fused to his stool, had sat up straighter. His cloudy eyes, which had been staring into an empty glass for the past hour, were now fixed on the young woman on stage. Her voice seemed to be pulling him out of a long, dark tunnel. For a moment, the hard lines on his face softened, and a flicker of something, a memory, a feeling, a ghost of a smile, appeared. Maybe it reminded him of a song his mother used to hum, or a promise he made to a girl a long, long time ago. The music was a time machine, and for a few minutes he wasn't just an old man in a lonely bar. He was young again, and full of hope. In the small sound booth, Gus the sound engineer was no longer just a technician. He had become a disciple. He had instinctively started to make small adjustments to the levels, not to fix anything, but to better capture the magic that was happening. He gently raised the level on her microphone, wanting to make sure every nuance, every breath, every crack of emotion in her voice was heard. He watched her on his small monitor, his professional detachment completely gone. He was witnessing something rare, something that people in his line of work talked about for years, a moment of pure, unfiltered talent. He felt a strange sense of pride, as if he had discovered her himself, near the back door. The members of The Wasted had frozen in place. Their loud, swaggering energy had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, humbled silence. The lead singer, the one who had called her Little Mouse, was standing with his mouth slightly agape, his guitar case slung over his shoulder. He was watching her, his smug expression completely wiped away, replaced by a look of disbelief and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. He was a musician, and he knew what he was seeing. This wasn't just a girl with a guitar. This was an artist. The wall of noise they had created with their 3 instruments and all their arrogance suddenly seemed cheap and hollow compared to the complex, emotional world she was building all by herself. They weren't just packing up their gear anymore. They were attending a master class on stage. The young woman was lost in her own creation. Her eyes were closed, her face tilted up toward the single spotlight as if it were the sun. Her body swayed gently, not in a practiced, performative way, but with the natural, unconscious rhythm of someone completely connected to their art. As the song built, she began to add more layers. With her free hand, she would reach down and tap another button on her pedal, adding a soft, ethereal harmony to her voice, or a shimmering, high-pitched guitar line that floated over the top of the dark, pulsing bass line. She was a one-woman orchestra, a conductor, and every instrument at the same time. The song itself was a story of quiet struggle and slow, stubborn hope. It was about being invisible in a crowded room, about having a voice so loud inside your head that you were scared to let it out. It was about finding strength in your own solitude, about learning to be your own band, your own audience, your own friend. And as she sang, the people in the bar felt it. They saw their own loneliness, their own secret fears, and their own quiet hopes reflected in her words and in the raw power of her voice. She reached the climax of the song, her voice soaring over the intricate web of sound she had created. It was a sound of release, of catharsis, of a dam finally breaking. It was a sound that said, I am here. I see you. You are not alone. And in that moment, no one was. The entire bar was a single breathing entity, united by the voice of the young woman who had, just minutes before, been a ghost in the corner. Then, as the final note of her voice hung in the air, she began to deconstruct her world. With a few precise taps of her foot, she faded out the layers one by one. First, the shimmering guitar line disappeared, leaving just the beat, the bass, and the memory of her voice. Then the bass line faded, leaving only the haunting high note and the soft, persistent heartbeat. And finally, with one last, gentle tap, the heartbeat faded away, leaving only the single, pure note, echoing in the profound silence of the room. She let that note hang for a long moment, a final, shimmering tear in the fabric of the night. Then she reached down and turned off the loop pedal. The note vanished, and there was silence. Not the empty, indifferent silence from before, but a heavy, thick, sacred silence. The silence of an audience that had forgotten it was an audience. The silence of people who had just shared something profound and didn't know how to react. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, waiting for their hearts to start beating again. The single, pure note vanished, and in its place a silence was born. It wasn't the empty, indifferent silence that had filled the bar before she began. This was a heavy, thick, sacred silence. It was a living thing, a shared breath held by every single person in the room. The air seemed to vibrate with the ghost of her voice, with the memory of the heartbeat she had created. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, trapped in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Their own thoughts and feelings suddenly laid bare. For the young woman on stage, the silence was deafening. The world she had so carefully built, note by note, beat by beat, had dissolved in an instant, and the real world came rushing back in. The spotlight, which had felt like the sun during her performance, now felt like a harsh, interrogating light, exposing every flaw, every trembling nerve. She was suddenly aware of the sweat on her forehead, the way her hands were shaking, the frantic, panicked beating of her own heart. The music had been her shield, her fortress. Now she was standing alone, naked and vulnerable, on a creaky wooden stage in a dimly lit bar. She felt a wave of nausea, the old fear returning with a vengeance. They hated it. They were so stunned by how awful it was that they couldn't even bring themselves to boo. She had made a complete fool of herself. She started to lower her guitar, her movements stiff and robotic. She needed to get off the stage. She needed to disappear back into the shadows, to pick up her case, and to run out the emergency exit and never look back. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, counting the scuffs and stains. Anything to avoid looking at the faces that were surely staring at her with pity or contempt. And then a sound broke the spell. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, deliberate clink. It was the old man at the end of the bar, slowly and carefully placing his empty glass down on the wooden counter. He looked at the glass for a moment, then he looked up at the stage and he began to clap. It wasn't a fast, enthusiastic clap. It was a slow, steady, respectful clap. 1, 2, 3. Each clap was like a single, clear drop of rain in a silent desert. The sound seemed to wake everyone up. The bartender, who had been staring as if in a trance, blinked and then joined in, his clapping a little faster, a little louder. The couple in the corner looked at each other, and the woman gave a small, watery smile before they both started to applaud. And then, like a dam breaking, the rest of the room followed. What started as a few scattered claps quickly grew into a roar. It wasn't just applause. It was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over the stage and hit her with the power of a gust of wind. It was an explosion of noise, a cathartic release of all the tension and emotion that had been building in the room. People were on their feet, their faces turned toward the stage, their expressions a mixture of awe, disbelief, and pure joy. They were whistling and shouting, "Bravo!" and more. The sound was so loud it seemed to make the empty beer bottles on the tables rattle. It filled every corner of the bar, pushing out the stale air and the old memories and replacing it with something new and alive. The young woman froze, her guitar still half lowered. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock. This roar, it wasn't for someone else. It was for her. The sound was a physical thing, a warm blanket that wrapped around her, chasing away the last of the cold fear. She saw the bartender, his face beaming, clapping his hands above his head. She saw the couple in the corner, holding hands, the woman wiping tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. She saw the old man, still clapping his slow, steady rhythm, a genuine, toothless smile on his face. Her eyes scanned the room and landed near the back door. The members of The Wasted were still there, frozen in place like statues. Their gear was piled at their feet, but they had forgotten all about it. The lead singer, the one who had called her Little Mouse, was standing with his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning, humbled understanding. He was a musician, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had just witnessed something he could never create. He wasn't looking at her with pity or contempt. He was looking at her with the kind of respect reserved for forces of nature. He slowly, almost unconsciously, brought his hands together and began to clap. In the small sound booth, Gus was leaning back in his chair, a huge, uncharacteristic grin spreading across his face. He gave her a small, appreciative nod, a gesture of professional and personal respect that meant more to her than all the shouting in the world. He had seen it all, and he knew. This was the real thing. The roar began to subside, softening from a tidal wave to a steady, rolling surf of applause. The young woman finally found her voice, though it came out as a small, shaky squeak. She whispered into the microphone. The sound was barely audible, but the crowd cheered it as if it were the most profound thing they had ever heard. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a strange and unfamiliar feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. She took a small, awkward bow, her guitar still in her hands. As she straightened up, she noticed a woman making her way through the crowd. She was different from the regular bar patrons. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored blazer and dark jeans, and she moved with a quiet confidence that cut through the lingering excitement. She had been sitting at a small table in the back, unnoticed by everyone, including the young woman on stage. She had been there the whole time. A silent observer, the woman reached the edge of the stage and waited for the last of the applause to die down. She looked up at the young woman, her eyes clear and intelligent. There was no pity in her gaze, no condescension. There was only a deep, professional curiosity. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice calm and measured. "My name is Elena. I'm a talent scout for a small indie label." The young woman just stared, her mind struggling to process the words. "A talent scout? Here? Now?" Elena smiled a small, knowing smile. "I came here tonight to see The Wasted," she admitted, gesturing with her head toward the still stunned band by the door. "I'd heard some buzz about them, but—" She let the sentence hang in the air, her meaning perfectly clear. She looked back at the stage, her eyes full of a genuine admiration that was almost overwhelming. "I have no idea who you are," Elena said, her voice soft but firm. "But I need to." That was breathtaking. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a simple, white business card. She held it out. The young woman hesitated for a second, then knelt down, her legs feeling like jelly, and took the card. It was a small, thin piece of cardstock, but it felt heavy in her hand, impossibly heavy. It had a name, a phone number, and an email address printed on it. It was a key, a door, a possibility. "Call me," Elena said. "Anytime. We can talk. No pressure, just call me." With one last appreciative nod, Elena turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd that was now starting to buzz with excited conversation. The young woman was left alone on the stage, clutching the guitar in one hand and the business card in the other. The spotlight still felt hot, but it didn't feel scary anymore. It felt like a beginning. The young woman stood on the stage, the business card feeling like a small, warm stone in her palm. The roar of the crowd had finally died down, replaced by a low, excited buzz that filled the air like electricity. People were talking, pointing at her, their faces alight with the shared experience they had just lived through. She felt a strange mix of exhilaration and an overwhelming desire to hide. The spotlight that had once been her greatest fear was now a shield, keeping the sea of faces at a distance. But she knew she couldn't stay under its protective glare forever. She took a shaky breath and knelt down to unplug her guitar, her fingers fumbling with the cable. As she was coiling it, she saw a pair of worn work boots approach the edge of the stage. It was Gus, the sound engineer. He wasn't scowling or looking at his watch. He was just standing there, holding her guitar case. "Here," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Let me help you with that." He placed the open case on the stage and held it steady while she gently laid her guitar inside, her most precious possession. "That was something else," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, but a small, genuine smile played on his lips. "You got a real gift, kid." He closed the latches on the case and handed it to her. The simple act of kindness, this small gesture of respect from the tired man who had wanted the night to be over, meant more to her than all the shouting in the world. She mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," and swung the case over her shoulder. As she turned to leave the stage, she saw the members of The Wasted gathering their things by the back door. The lead singer looked up and their eyes met for a brief second. There was no smirk, no sneer. He just gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one musician to another. It was an apology and a sign of respect, all rolled into one. She nodded back, a small, hesitant movement, and then she was walking down the steps. Off the stage and into the crowd, for the first time that night, the crowd parted for her. People stepped aside, creating a path for her to walk through. A few people reached out and patted her on the shoulder, offering quiet words of encouragement as she passed. "You were amazing," one woman whispered. "Thank you," said a man with kind eyes. She felt like she was walking in a dream, a ghost who had suddenly become solid. She kept her head down, clutching her guitar case with one hand and the business card with the other, and made her way toward the door. The cool night air hit her face like a splash of water, and she took a deep, cleansing breath. The city was alive with its own music, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a passing train, the murmur of voices from people walking down the street. But it all sounded different now. It was no longer just noise. It was part of a rhythm, a pulse that she felt connected to. She started walking toward the bus stop, her steps no longer feeling heavy and leaden. But light and purposeful, she sat on the hard plastic bench at the bus stop, under the flickering orange glow of the streetlight. She pulled the business card out of her pocket and looked at it again. The name Elena, the phone number. It was real. It wasn't a dream. The performance, the silence, the roar, the card, it had all actually happened. A wave of doubt, cold and sharp, washed over her. What if it was a mistake? What if Elena was just caught up in the moment? What if she called and the woman had already forgotten her face, forgotten her name? The old fear, the voice of the little mouse, started to whisper in her ear. Asterisk, don't be silly. It was just one song. Go back to your quiet life. It's safer there. Asterisk, she looked up at the night sky, searching for the moon, but the city lights were too bright. She thought about the feeling of being on stage, of building that world with her loop pedal and her voice. She thought about the silence that had followed, and the roar that came after. She thought about the old man's slow, steady clap, and the tear on the woman's cheek. She thought about Gus's smile. That was real, and she had made it happen. The little mouse didn't build worlds. The little mouse didn't make people cry and cheer. The little mouse stayed hidden in the shadows. She wasn't the little mouse anymore. She was Midnight. And Midnight had to be brave. Back in her small apartment, the silence felt different. It was no longer a lonely, empty silence, but a peaceful, creative one. The room, which usually felt like a cage, now felt like a sanctuary. She placed her guitar case gently against the wall, like a trusted friend. She walked over to her small kitchen table and laid the business card down in the center of it. She stared at it for a long time, as if it might disappear. The next morning, she woke up with the sun. The fear was still there, a low hum of anxiety in her chest, but it was overshadowed by a new feeling, determination. She went about her day, working her shift at the coffee shop, but her mind was a million miles away. She was no longer just a barista taking orders and steaming milk. She was a musician with a decision to make. The world of lattes and cappuccinos seemed to fade into the background, a black-and-white movie playing while she was living in full color after her shift. She went home, took a deep breath, and picked up her phone. Her hands were trembling as she dialed the number on the card. It rang 3 times, each ring sending a jolt of panic through her. Just as she was about to hang up, a voice answered. "Elena speaking." "Hi," the young woman said, her voice barely a whisper. It's midnight. From the rusty nail last night?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought the woman didn't remember. Then Elena's voice came back, warm and full of recognition. "Of course! I was hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about your set all day. How are you?" They talked for 20 minutes. It was the easiest conversation she had ever had with a stranger. Elena didn't talk about record deals or image or marketing. She asked about the songs, about the loop pedal, about what inspired her. She listened, really listened, in a way that made the young woman feel like her music, her art, truly mattered. At the end of the call, they set up a time to meet at Elena's small studio later that week. The studio wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a flashy, high-tech building in a trendy part of town. It was a small, slightly cluttered space above a record store, filled with old instruments, posters of obscure bands, and the comforting smell of dust and electronics. It felt like a creative space, a place where real music was made. They sat in a small, cozy office, drinking tea and talking about music for hours. Elena played her some of the other artists on her label, and the young woman was surprised to find that she liked them all. They were all unique, all artists with a strong, singular vision. It was the first time she had ever felt like she might have found her tribe. A week later, she was back behind the counter at the coffee shop. The morning rush was in full swing, and a customer was complaining that his latte wasn't hot enough. In the past, she would have shrunk, apologized profusely, and remade the drink with a feeling of shame. But this time, she just looked at the man, a calm, detached feeling washing over her. She remade the drink, handed it to him with a polite smile, and moved on to the next customer. His anger, his impatience, it was just noise. It couldn't touch her anymore. She had a secret world inside her, a world of melodies and rhythms and possibilities. She was a barista, yes, but she was also a musician. She was midnight. That night she was back in her small apartment. She didn't turn on the TV or scroll through her phone. She just picked up her guitar. She didn't play the song from the bar. Instead, she started to hum a new melody, a bright, hopeful tune that had been bouncing around in her head all day. She closed her eyes, her fingers finding the strings, and began to build a new world, one note at a time. She didn't know if she would ever be famous or if she would ever sell a single record, but it didn't matter. The victory wasn't in the applause or the business card. The victory was in the quiet moment, alone in her room, with a guitar in her hands and a song in her heart. She had found her voice, and she was never going to be silent again.